Okay, it seems like it is officially time, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. All right, well, good day, and welcome to our fall webinar speaker series hosted, or more like our winter webinar speaker series hosted by the International Society for Industrial Ecology. My name is Mai Ichihara, and I will be your host for today's webinar titled Decoupling Urban Densities, Benefits and Costs. The ISIE webinar series invites leading practitioners and researchers from various fields to talk about the latest opportunities and developments in industrial ecology. In today's webinar, we will explore the benefits and costs of urbanization with emphasis on population density and its implications for urban sustainability. Here with us is our speaker for today, Clint Andrews. Clint Andrews is a professor of urban planning, director of the Rutgers Center for Green Building, and associate dean for faculty at Rutgers University's Bloustein School. He teaches courses on environmental planning and performs research on how people use the built environment. He publishes both scholarly and popular articles and has written books such as Humble Analysis, The Practice of Joint Fact-Finding, Regulating Regional Power Systems, and Industrial Ecology and Global Change. He is co-editor of the Journal of Planning, Education, and Research, a fellow of AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and past president of the IEEE Society on Social Implications of Technology. So before we begin, we would like to remind our listeners that we welcome any questions you might have, and I will direct them to our speaker towards the end of the talk. Throughout the presentation, please feel free to type questions directly into the Zoom Q&A window. That's the one titled Q&A and not the one labeled chat. So with that, we welcome Clint Andrews. Go ahead, Clint.
Okay, thanks, Mai, and Happy New Year to you all. What I'm going to do for the next half hour, roughly, a little more than a half hour, is talk about one of the big debates that has been playing out over centuries, really, about whether it's better to live close to one another or to have a little bit of space. And then along with that, there are all sorts of implications, some of which are environmental. And so I want to talk through the nature of the intellectual debate, where there's pretty strong opinions, and I can even caricature them, and then work through some density definitions, think about what are the benefits that accrue to urban density, what are its costs, are there ways to separate those costs from the benefits, and then pull it all together at the end. And so to start with the dogma, we all know that it's an increasingly urban world. We've seen the United Nations population projections that say we have just achieved this point where 50% of humanity lives in cities. And as we look forward, the projections show that in every continent, that proportion is only going to increase over the next century or so. And further, if we look at the percentage of the urban population in different sized cities, we see that a larger fraction are going to be living in the largest cities. So we are seeing urbanization both absolutely and relatively. And it's worth thinking about Harvey Perloff's famous comment that the future has components that are rooted in the past that relate to present choices and that depend on future uncertainties. And all of those are going to play a role in what actually happens, which is why we can actually feel empowered to act in spite of whatever we see in terms of trends. There are a couple of famous icons in the worlds of architecture and planning that are useful reference here. And I'm going to pigeonhole Frank Lloyd Wright as the defender of dispersal and Le Corbusier as the defender of density here. And just to remind you all, Frank Lloyd Wright is famous for his prairie-style architecture that just blends into the landscape and has colors that make sense and materials that make sense for places. And his vision, his urban vision, looked a little bit like this. You know, he envisioned the suburb. He envisioned an acre for every household, for every person, in fact. And the idea was to drive towards self-sufficiency, towards enough space that you could grow your own vegetables and have nice clean air to breathe. And so his Broadacre city looked a lot like many of the current landscapes in North America and parts of Europe. And when we got down to the details of his architecture, a good place to go turns out to be near Chicago, Illinois, where he built a series of wonderful houses that only make sense in a suburban landscape. And here are a few of them illustrated. And you can see this was more than a century ago that he was exploring this. You know, in many ways, these feel like the English manor house reduced in size and packed together a little bit. By contrast, we can think of Le Corbusier, you know, a Swiss who spent most of his life in France, who had a somewhat different vision. He was much more of a modernist. His built works include icons like the United Nations Tower, and his urban planning vision looked an awful lot like many of the fringes of Paris, certain parts of New York City. Those cruciform towers are things that have actually been built all over the place. And these were important in everywhere from, you know, Chandigarh to Brasilia, in places that actually got built. And so it's clear there's different points of view about what the ideal settlement patterns should be. And there are strong arguments for both dispersal and centralization. But let's think through a little bit of what comes along with those choices. And so the standard claims of what urban density brings are, on the one hand, we hear about social ills. We hear about the famous Chicago public housing complexes that warehoused the poor and created a critical mass of unruly youth and became the turf of gangs. And many of these towers, which look an awful lot like what Corbusier was proposing, eventually were knocked down because people thought that they promoted social ills to too great an extent. On the other hand, we've seen for many decades now eco-efficiency arguments. And one of the classics is from Newman and Kenworthy back almost 30 years ago, where they identified a relationship between petroleum usage per person for transportation and urban density in persons per hectare. And so you have at the resource inefficient end a city like Houston, Texas, or Los Angeles, California, and you have at the resource efficient end a city like Hong Kong or perhaps Singapore. And that is illustrative of an argument that we hear over and over again about how great density is from a, let's say, an industrial ecologist's point of view. And so if we're thinking about today's cities making choices and about future cities, we would like to think about what are the net benefits. We see that there are costs, we see that there are benefits associated with density, but how can we think systematically about them? And so to help us do that, I want to quickly walk through the definitions and then the benefits and the costs and the decoupling. And just to remind us, there are layers of argumentation you can make. I've just pulled up one that we see from David Bristow and Chris Kennedy about how cities are dissipative structures, and therefore they're worth our attention because of their nature. And I'll actually argue that it's the civilization itself that's the dissipative structure, and that cities are, reducing entropy locally at the expense of increasing entropy elsewhere. Okay, so definition. It turns out there's several ways to do this. You can talk about population density. How many people are there per hectare or per acre or per square kilometer? You can also talk about residential density. How many dwelling units are there in that given area? Or employment density. How many jobs are there? And those three relate to one another to some extent, but they are, in fact, slightly different. And, you do see in many places a business district that has low residential density but high employment density, and similarly residential districts that are don't have many employees. There are a couple of other measures, one other that I want to mention, and that's floor area ratio, the total floor area of a building divided by the land area of the parcel. And what that does is give you a sense of whether people are building buildings vertically, is it multi-story buildings, and how much of the land is given over to the building footprint. And all of this suggests that scale is an important qualifier on density. And as you go from the parcel to the neighborhood, to the district, to the city, to the region, you're going to want to be careful about your comparisons. You wouldn't want to compare a population density for a city to a population density for a neighborhood, because it wouldn't be apples to apples, because a city is going to include both the employment and the residents and the circulation, whereas a neighborhood might only include one of those. Now, I'm based in the United States, and so I most often use acres and square miles. I've tried to put this presentation in terms of hectares and square kilometers to make it more accessible, but I will slip up occasionally. I've got a table here to give you a little bit of a flavorful insight. And so Frank Lloyd Wright, the dispersal advocate, his Broadacre city, his ideal design, would have a population density of about 5 people per hectare. Whereas Le Corbusier's voisin Paris plan would bring us in a couple of orders of magnitude higher, 319 people per hectare. And then if we look at actual neighborhoods in Brasilia, which was, you can tie to Le Corbusier's theme, 280, not too far from Corbusier's model. If you go to Hong Kong, you'll find the near the central metro station that we're talking an order of magnitude higher, almost 2,400 people per hectare. In the Chamda Bazaar area in Mumbai, we're talking 3,000 people per hectare. Boston's North End, which is a wonderful, walkable, historic neighborhood, 200 odd people per hectare. New York City's Co-op City, which looks like Corbusier, 400 odd people per hectare. So just keep those in mind, keep those markers in mind as we talk. When we jump up to the nation level, we see population density patterns like these. The United States as a whole has a lot of empty area, and it has some pockets of density, and they are along where our major cities are, along the coast, around the San Francisco Bay and Los Angeles areas. When you go to a country like China, you also see vast empty areas, but a much larger section on its east coast, which is packed. Now, as we look within cities, we see incredible differences between center city and the outer edges. And the most dense portions of Mumbai and Shanghai are much more dense than the most dense parts of a city like London. And that shows up in the urban morphology, you know, the pattern of the streets and buildings, as well as in the mapping of population density. Okay, let's enumerate some of the benefits of packing people close together. I'm going to go through a series of these. A couple will be tongue-in-cheek, but many of these are quite serious, and people argue about them and study them and have confirmed repeatedly that these benefits exist. So one thing is that you see wealth correlating with density. The more density there is, the more wealth there is. And this explains, and density explains wealth better than scale explains wealth. So it's not just being in a large city that's going to correlate well. It's having that population density. You can look at interaction. That increases with scale, it turns out, although local interaction increases with density. And what I'm doing is I'm really giving us some best hits from the literature as we go along. And so this particular piece came out of a piece in Nature Communications in about 7 years ago. Okay, it turns out that patents, which is a good indicator of sort of a good predictor of economic success, follows transportation access better than things like density. And this is historical work here showing how places that have patents differentiated those from not having patents on the basis of when did the railroad arrive. And so, you know, a century and a half ago, we were already seeing this benefit of connectivity. Echoing the Newman and Kenworthy graph of previously, this is another one of the famous graphs. Density improves transport efficiency, measured in megajoules per year for transportation-related energy use. And so Hong Kong, Mumbai, Ho Chi Minh City are at the efficient high-density end, and Atlanta, Houston, Denver are at the inefficient low-density end of things. You can get a little bit more subtle. And so this is a nice study from the UK that shows that as you increase density, you only slightly reduce the mode share for automobiles. And what you do instead is you empower public transport. So you don't weaken cars as much as you empower public transport. And as you look across Europe, you see that in fact you are able to reduce the car mode share, which of course is the least, or is the most energy intensive mode of transportation, as you go from the most dense to the least dense. If we look at infrastructures, water treatment, this is data from the United States, from the Journal of the American Water Works Association. And here we can see very clearly that scale economies exist. It's better to build a few very large water treatment plants than lots of little ones. And we see the same thing in sewage treatment. Here I've got Italian data. The volume of wastewater treated, the unit cost drops dramatically as scale increases. But if we want to disentangle scale and density, we have to get a little bit more careful. And there was a nice paper using Spanish data that I want to highlight here that attempts to do that. And just to illustrate, we can see that for water supply in Spain, a 1% increase in scale yields a 0.6% increase in costs. So there are scale economies because it's a, 1 yields only a 0.6 increase in costs. And if you look at the role of density, you can see a 1% increase in density yields a 0.4% increase in costs. And so in fact, density is a little bit stronger an explainer of cost effectiveness than scale. That's water supply. You can carry it through other infrastructures. I'm going to skip this one. Basically, runoff has much more to do, nutrient runoff from lawns has much more to do with how much lawn area each household has. And so with density, you have smaller lawns. It's fairly obvious. Now, there are social correlates of density as well. And here we see in the United States that there is a decrease in suicide rates as density increases. On the other hand, teen pregnancies in the UK don't seem related to density at all. If we look at mass shootings, we really don't see density explaining any of this, and frankly, urban scale doesn't explain it either. This is much more about our gun laws and our cultural practices. So pulling this all together, there are several useful studies that have identified all of these correlates of density, population density. Richard Florida did us a service by blogging about it, and with Michelle Hopgood's help, put together a nice summary. So we see that wages correlate with density, income, economic output, percent of college graduates in the population, percentage of creative class people, presence of the arts, culture, media, and entertainment, science and technology, business and management, all correlate with density. Medicine and education don't. Working class, there's a negative correlation. Analytical skills, slight positive correlation. Social intelligence, positive correlation. Physical skills, negative correlation. High-tech industry, positive correlation. Innovation, positive correlation. Foreign-born, bohemians, gays, positive correlation. Unfortunately, also housing costs, positive correlation with density. Driving alone to work, negative correlation. Biking to work, a positive correlation. Happiness and well-being, a positive correlation. So I've been talking mostly about benefits. Let's shift our lens to costs now. And having spent a fair amount of time in the various ring roads of Beijing, I've been in one of these cars and sat there for a long time. Traffic congestion always increases with density. Air pollution concentrations worsen with density. This happens to be a one-year snapshot of Beijing. You'd find something even worse if you went to Delhi. Epidemics, there's nothing like having neighbors close at hand to make it easy for disease transmission. And then a little bit tongue-in-cheek, there is no sex in the city, apparently. It's sort of like if you put two rats in a small box, they'll eat one another. You can model something similar, and whether you frame reproductive success as males competing with one another to win passive females, or whether you frame it as females choosing the best available male, they both should run into problems as density increases. The proportion of unsuccessful males should be increasing. Now, actual real data, as opposed to modeling, shows that we've developed lots of workarounds. And so we are unlikely to actually achieve density-based extinction. Now, density is costly. And this is a very simple thing of it costs more to build a high-rise building than it does to build a low-rise building on a per square meter basis. Because you need to have elevators, you need to pump the water up to the top floor, all sorts of things like that. And so it's no wonder that housing costs more in cities, because it costs more to build it. There's a very interesting set of papers. This is one from 2015 that basically looks at the some of these different positive and negative factors and divides things into what scales sublinearly with urban scale and separately urban density, and what increases linearly and what increases superlinearly. And this basically summarizes what we've already heard before, which is that things like R&D employment, patents, inventors, super creatives, wages, those all scale superlinearly with the size of the city, and it turns out with density, whereas things like the amount of road surface you need per person is scales sublinearly. And what people like Louis Bettencourt and other people who work in this vein have found is that density drives the superlinear regime, all those good things like patents and inventors and creatives, and size drives the linear and sublinear regimes. Okay, so that's our quick tour of the benefits and costs of density. Now to the meat of it. Is it possible to decouple the costs and benefits? Can we think of ways to make our cities enjoy the benefits without suffering the costs? To help us think about this, this is a famous picture of Monet, from Monet, politely called The Sun Shining Through the Fog. What it really shows is the Houses of Parliament in London, where the sun is trying to shine through the smog from all the coal smoke that was present back in those days. And so I want to propose that there are 4 decoupling strategies that warrant serious attention from us, that we should focus on the problems, not density itself, that we should make sure that we think at multiple levels and scales about our improvements, that we pay close attention to designing our habitats for what I'm calling unaugmented humans. So assuming that humans are just on their 2 feet and don't have vehicles. And finally, that we should work to empower individuals and acknowledge that people are adaptive and have agency. Okay, so to the first point, targeting a specific problem. Let's go back to London, and only a few people probably can remember London's Great Smog of 1952. I can't, that was a few years before I was born. But it was a devastating thing, thousands of people died. And from that, several policy lessons emerged. The first was, let's stop using coal for heating buildings and for powering local industries in densely populated areas. The second thing was, let's regulate power plant emissions to scrub the bad stuff out, the sulfur dioxide and so forth. And third, let's start regulating vehicle emissions so that all those tailpipes aren't contributing to problems And for the industrial ecology community, one thing this should suggest is that it's valuable if we analyze the complete causal chains for problems, but focus on problems that people really care about, like their health. And then secondly, it suggests that we should be spending a lot of time systematically investigating the unintended consequences of any changes that we undertake. Sticking with London for a minute, let's target another specific problem, in this case, traffic congestion. And London famously imposed a congestion charge around its center city. And from that, a couple of policy lessons emerged. And I'm citing other people's work here, something from the Journal of Public Economics and something from JPAM, that shows first that prices can change behavior, and second, that citizens eventually come around to appreciating the change, even if they complain at first. And the graph I've highlighted here shows how, as prior to implementing the congestion charge, the number of traffic accidents during working hours was pretty high, and following implementation of the congestion charge, that dropped. And it dropped relative to even the underlying national trend in the UK for reduced traffic accidents based on, better cars and seat belts and all that kind of stuff. And so the industrial ecology community should very clearly evaluate policy experiments and to see which predicted consequence actually occur. It's not enough to just do prospective stuff. A second class of solutions, and that's the multi-scale solution I mentioned. And here I want to offer a historical example from Copenhagen, where back after World War II, they came up with this brilliant analogy of the 5 fingers of Copenhagen. And that became the basis for their guiding plan, where they built infrastructure corridors extending out from the central city, and then encouraged not only transportation and but also district heating followed those corridors, and the most dense housing units were built along those corridors, and altogether it's made it quite a livable place, and it's also eco-efficient. It also has the benefit that is highlighted in the upper right here, this notion of transects, where you can imagine a rural to urban transect, and where what you really want is for people in every transect category, from dense urban to decentralized, to have relatively quick access to other types of zones so that you can enjoy a diverse life. And that's possible with the 5-finger arrangement of Copenhagen. So in other words, it's multi-scale thinking. Policy lessons that emerged from experiments like this is that regional governance is important and needs to be paid attention to and enforced. Second, there are more and less efficient infrastructure layouts, and we should figure out what they are. And third, that it improves your quality of life and people's satisfaction if you ensure local access to diverse landscapes. One thing this means for the industrial ecology community is that we shouldn't get all hung up just on doing things like reducing CO2 emissions. We need to embed that in these broader trade-offs and to ensure high quality of life as well. And then it also means that we need to learn how to study multi-level phenomena, which means thinking about behavior and performance in context, to think about nestedness and so forth. Okay, another multi-scale solution, and that's transit-oriented development. And here I'm showing pictures of the outskirts of Washington, D.C., where they built a transit line and then encouraged dense development around each transit stop. And that has proved to be quite successful for making walkable neighborhoods that have both employment and residence but also easy access to the outdoors for people living in these places. It's efficient. It supports multimodal transportation, so you can do things like take a bike share from one transit stop and ride your bike to the next transit stop and drop it off. And so the policy lesson that emerges from transit-oriented development is to emphasize accessibility and not just mobility, to recognize the value of having multiple ways of getting around. And for the industrial ecology community, I think we need to frame things around end use activities, and be sure we understand what the impacts of different types of activities are. The next major class of solution I want to offer is this idea of designing viable habitats for unaugmented humans. And this really means respecting human physiology and human psychology, and that we should be following the scales at which the human senses operate, and the scales at which our bodies are able to get us around. In the upper right is a famous picture from Jan Gehl's architectural practice, where he shows us that at a couple of 100 meters, we can just barely determine that that blob is a human. And as we get to maybe 100 meters, we might be able to detect whether the person is coming towards us or away from us. And at 50 meters, maybe 75 meters, we can detect gender. And as we get closer and closer, additional senses kick in as you go from sight to hearing, being able to shout at one another, to a sense of smell, and then if you're lucky enough, maybe a sense of taste up close. And all of this has informed architectural practice for millennia, and urban planning practice for a somewhat shorter period of time, but it has not really entered into what I'll call urban planning analysis to much of an extent, and it really needs to. So policy lessons are that we ought to design for accessibility by humans who have particular challenges, the most vulnerable among us, children, the elderly, those who are mobility challenged. Secondly, we really should be collecting evidence on what works and using that to inform the design process. Those are both activities that the industrial ecology community can help with. And that, in addition, we should be thinking about modeling systems using realistic behavioral assumptions and not some broad assumption about Homo economicus or some silly thing like that. And we also should be thinking about designs and solutions that are what we would call behaviorally robust, given that people will behave differently from one another. And in that spirit, we can go right to urban design as an action that lets us make things better with wide sidewalks, functional crosswalks, inviting streetscapes, urban refuges, and we should be able to model that work. And the little animation I have in the lower right-hand corner is an agent-based model that illustrates this, and it's smart enough to be able to recognize that when people step off a curb, that's a challenge, and not everybody can do that. We ought to be measuring what works, and so walk score maps are now becoming prevalent. This is an example of one for the New York City. And of course, measuring density is just the beginning. We should also be measuring things like connectivity and enclosure, which are relatively easy to measure, and urban grain, urban scale, consistency of settlement patterns, permeability, which are measurable with more difficulty. And then there are a few that are empirically challenging, variability and diversity, that promise a good research agenda for future years. And finally, the human agency, encouraging agency theme. Here I've got a London example showing where the traffic jams are, and this is something that it turns out that empowering individuals to make the right choice in avoiding traffic depends on some top-down support. We need to have Google Maps in place to be able to pull that off. Broadly, for industrial ecologists, we need to incorporate feedback, information feedback, into our behavioral models. One other example, indoor air quality. People will improve their own indoor air quality while they're waiting for government and industry to get their act together in improving outdoor air quality. This is something that we see going on in China right now. It also leads us to suggest things like this is some work of ours in New York City, that we get better indoor air quality in buildings with central air conditioning. And so therefore, maybe air conditioning should be a right and not merely a privilege. That can be a controversial statement if you're thinking about the energy implications, of course. Okay, so to wrap up, urban density is an important phenomenon. Urbanization is the theme of this century. Density in particular comes with both costs and benefits. It's more than just dogma and ideology. There's a lot of empirical evidence for both the costs and the benefits. But I suggest there are ways to do a decoupling, in particular by targeting specific problems and not tarring density as the problem. Secondly, by doing multi-level improvements that work at a couple of different levels or scales to that reinforce one another. Third, to design for real humans, and especially those who are the most vulnerable among us. And finally, to empower individuals to be able to adapt locally. Not all solutions have to be global. And through all of this, I argue that there is an important role for the industrial ecology community, and I hope we will all continue to work on this stuff. So that's my talk, coming to you from the most densely populated part of the United States. New Jersey is the most dense, has the highest population density of any US state, and of course we're right next door to New York, which has the highest population density in North America. And with that, I'll stop and see if there are any questions or comments. Thanks all.
All right, thank you so much, Clint, for that wonderful presentation. And we will now have a brief Q&A session. And so please, if you have any questions, please go ahead and submit it into the Q&A box. And as a reminder, I will be moderating the discussion. So seems like no one has typed into the Q&A box, so I will go ahead and kick us off with a question. So, Clint, we talked about this earlier, but how should industrial ecologists talk to urban planners? Because you'd mentioned that they're somewhat different worlds, but they're both interested in urban phenomenon.
Yeah, okay, thanks for that question. There are professions that deal with the design and operation of cities. Urban planning, which is my academic home here at Rutgers, is one of them. Civil engineering is another. And there's a division of labor. The planners try to think about land use patterns and long-term coordination of infrastructure, public investments with private investments in buildings, for example, and to be able to deal with the externalities or the unintended consequences of actions. And that means that planners typically pay a lot of attention to decision process and to make sure that there's public participation where participation is warranted, and that things are well explained. The civil engineers instead tend to focus on the design and performance of particular systems, whether it's a water system or a sewage system or building structures. And industrial ecology, which is not really a profession, it's kind of evolved as a cool metaphor that maybe suggests some scientific insights. And the early writers in this area, came out of the sciences and engineering and tended to seek scientific levels of proof and scientific approaches. We want evidence. We want to build. We wanted to be able to describe urban systems, be able to explain urban systems, and be able to predict their behavior. None of that necessarily is helpful with the design of a city or persuading people to do the right thing in managing a city. And so I think industrial ecologists if they want practitioners to pay attention to their work, they have to frame it in terms that's actionable. And that I think it's a reasonable request. It's something that more and more funders of scientific research are demanding. We see that over and over again with our National Science Foundation, for example, that they now want not just scientific merit, but they want a clear demonstration of broader impact. And I think we need to be asking the same from the industrial ecology community. In other words, let's recognize that it's ought to aspire to have application. We need to aspire to be an applied science and not only something that attempts to describe and explain.
Great, thank you so much. And it looks like we don't have any questions, so I think we should just wrap it up right here. Again, thank you so much, Clint, for joining us today and for sharing your wealth of knowledge on urban density and its benefits and costs. And thank you as well to all of the participants. And to view a recording of this webinar, please visit the member portal on the ISIE website. All right, have a wonderful day, everyone.
Okay, thanks.